Good evening and welcome on behalf of Studium Generale Groningen to this lecture on winners and losers. My name is Sander van Doorn. I'm a junior group leader at the Theoretical Biology Group at the Center of Evolutionary and Ecological Studies here at our university. So this is a second lecture in our series on winners and losers. And today we will take a broader biological perspective and ask how can we explain the existence of winner and loser effects from an evolutionary viewpoint. So winner and loser effects have been demonstrated to exist in a wide variety of biological species, including man, other primate species, birds, fish, insects, also crayfish. And in many cases, having these winner and loser effects actually help social groups of animals to establish a dominance hierarchy without spilling too much blood on escalated fights. So if winners are more likely to win future conflicts, and if losers are more likely to lose future conflicts, then this actually helps to stabilize dominance relationships within a group. And as a result, we often see that dominance hierarchies and relationships establish quite quickly within social groups. And once these dominance relationships have been established, of course, these provide a means to solve conflicts within social groups without spilling blood, effectively. So still, this is not really, at least for evolutionary biologists, a good explanation for understanding why winner and loser effects exist. So they may be good for the group as a whole, as an efficient way of resolving conflicts, but still is it also in the interest of every individual group member that these social conventions or these winner-loser effects exist. So imagine that you would be the individual at the bottom of the hierarchy. What would prevent you from overturning this social convention, ignoring the loser effect, and in that way kind of climbing up on the social rank order and be able to distribute your genes to the next generation? So that is a kind of a big puzzle in evolutionary biology. So if anyone can answer this question, then it would be our speaker of tonight, Professor Dr. Lee Dugatkin. I'm not sure if he will address this specific question, but at least he will give us a good overview of his work on winner and loser effects. So Professor Dugatkin is a professor and a distinguished university scholar in the Department of Biology at the University of Louisville, Kentucky in the United States. He is an expert in behavioral ecology and social evolution. He has published far more than 100 papers in scientific journals and published quite a number of influential textbooks on game theory, social evolution, behavioral ecology. So he has very broad scientific interests. So he's worked on cooperation, mate choice, copying, cultural evolution, risk-taking behavior, and of course on animal conflicts and the evolution of winner and loser effects. And these will be central to his talk today. So Dr. Dugatkin will speak for about an hour, and then afterwards we have about 30 minutes for questions and discussion. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Dugatkin, and I look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I've really been looking forward to this trip for a while now. In addition to getting a chance to talk to you, I had all day to walk around your lovely city, and I enjoyed it. I don't know if it's always quite as beautiful in February as it was today, but I got lucky, and I loved it. I went to the top of the church. The lady who sold me the ticket said it's an easy walk up to the top. I don't know if it was an easy walk, but I really enjoyed it and had a chance to explore many different places. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing in my lab on these winner and loser effects. And so basically, I'm a behavioral ecologist. I'm interested in the evolution of social behavior. And as you heard, some of the things that we work on in my lab are things like the evolution of cooperation and altruism, mate choice, lots of questions in behavioral ecology. I think maybe the one thing that unites a lot of them is I have an interest in questions that sort of sit right between biology and psychology, and certainly winner and loser effects as one of these issues. I know the other speakers in this series are talking to you much more about work on winners and losers in humans. What I'm going to try and do is give you an overview of winner and loser effects in non-humans, talk about a little bit of theoretical work, and talk about a little bit of empirical work on this as well. So first, I'll just take a couple of minutes to give you an overview and a few definitions so that we're all starting from the same place. Then I'll talk to you about some experimental work that we've done in my laboratory on winner and loser effects, but not so much just demonstrating that winner effects and loser effects exist, but much more trying to understand what those winner and loser effects mean in terms of the dominance hierarchies that are so common in social creatures. So we'll talk about some experimental work we've done on that. And then I'll end with a couple of models that myself and my colleagues have been working on for a while that try and see whether or not winner and loser effects help us understand the types of hierarchies that we see in nature. I'll come back to that in much more detail later on. So if you go into the literature on fighting ability and dominance hierarchies in non-humans, what you find there are a lot of things that affect the probability of winning or losing a fight. And for the most part, up until about 15 or 20 years ago, most of the work focused on things like size. So larger animals tend to defeat smaller animals, larger animals tend to be at the top of dominance hierarchies, and the opposite for smaller animals. Strength, which is often highly correlated with size. Again, stronger animals tend to win more. They tend to end up on the top of the hierarchy, and vice versa for smaller animals. Weaponry. Individuals who have larger weapons tend to win more fights. Condition is another one of these important variables. So animals that, for example, are well-fed tend to end up winning fights, ending up at the top of a hierarchy, and you get this kind of feedback loop where you end up at the top of the hierarchy because you have more resources, and then when you're at the top of the hierarchy, you get even more resources and stay up there. But so all of these things are what you might think of as intrinsic to the animal. Okay, so what I mean by that is it's something about the animal themselves, almost sort of from the inside out. You can measure the size of an animal. You can measure its weaponry. You can measure its strength. You can measure its condition. And for a long time, these were the things that people in behavioral ecology looked at when they studied who wins fights and how hierarchies form. But over the last couple of decades, and much more so over the last few years, people have been really focusing on what are referred to as extrinsic effects, things that are sort of outside of the animal, but that are important for determining whether they're going to win a fight or lose a fight or where they end up in a hierarchy. And these extrinsic effects, there's a number of them, and we'll focus on these winner and loser effects. Oh, let me go back here. Sorry. But, and I'll define these in just a minute, but even though I'm not going to discuss them in depth, I want to mention a couple of other things that are really important here. One is something called the bystander effect, and one is something called the audience effect. So when you have bystander effects, what it means is that you observe the interaction between others, and then you determine what you're going to do based on what you've seen. So if I see one person defeat another individual, when I interact with them, I'm going to take that into account. I pay attention to what I've seen them do. The audience effect is sort of the opposite. There's work in non-humans and in humans that suggests that if you're being watched, you behave differently. So if you're being watched by members of the opposite sex in particular, you behave differently in aggressive interactions than if you're not being watched. And all of these things together, in addition to alliances and coalitions, teams that individuals form, all of these things have taken a much larger role in the way that behavioral ecologists study winning, losing, and dominance hierarchies. So I'm going to talk primarily about these winner and loser effects. And what I mean by a winner effect is that the probability that you win a fight at some time is a function of prior interactions. So if you win a fight, you're much more likely to win the next time. That's what a winner effect is. The more interactions you have and that you win, the greater the probability that you're going to win the next time. So winning produces more winning. Okay? And a loser effect is the opposite. Losing an interaction makes you more likely to lose subsequent interactions. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is that these winner and loser effects are independent of one another. So you could have a winner effect in play, but no loser effect. And you could have a loser effect, but no winner effect. So for example, in some species of animals, if an individual loses, they're much more likely to lose subsequent interactions. But they're not any more likely to win if they've won in the past. So we have loser effects, but no winner effects. We can have winner effects, but no loser effects. Or you can have both in play at the same time. Let me give you a couple of examples of animal systems in which people have studied just the presence or absence of winner and loser effects. And then we'll get into the questions I talked about at the start. So these are copperhead snakes, and they can be quite aggressive with each other, particularly the males. And up here I've just got 6 different kinds of aggressive interactions that can happen in these copperhead snakes. So if you study this species, what you find is there are no winner effects. If you win a fight, you're not any more likely to win subsequent fights. But there's a really, really strong loser effect. If you lose a fight, your probability of losing fights after that increases dramatically. Males, for example, after they've lost a fight, or particularly after they've lost 2 fights, have almost a 0 probability of winning future fights. And this is important because females choose males who win fights as their mates. And so there are strong fitness consequences to these loser effects in copperheads. Here is a picture of blue-footed booby birds. And I love this picture because it just makes you feel really good. It's just a very calm, loving picture. But it turns out that these birds can be quite aggressive towards one another, particularly chicks in the same nest, where there's a limited amount of food that comes in. And chicks can be very aggressive with one another. And people have studied winner and loser effects in these blue-footed boobies. And in this species, you get both effects. If you win, you're more likely to win. If you lose, you're more likely to lose. And these effects have been demonstrated in everything from crayfish to birds to primates to many, many, many different kinds of creatures. I'm going to talk to you about some experimental work that we've done on this in the green swordtail fish. And first, let me just show you what aggression looks like in these guys. It's very easy to measure. Okay? You just watch them, and you can tell when aggressive interactions are occurring, and you can tell who's winning these interactions. And if you let this go on for a while, not an extremely long period of time, very quickly, one of these fish would be swimming around the middle of the tank, and the other fish would be just sitting in a corner praying that he's left alone for the rest of the time in the tank, and just staying up in the corner, very timid. So it's very, very easy to watch these guys and measure aggression. They form dominance hierarchies both in the laboratory and in the field. I'm not going to discuss this work because we haven't done it, but there's all kinds of nice work you can do on the hormonal correlates of aggression in these fish. You can measure testosterone, you can measure stress hormones like cortisol, that sort of thing. And they're very, very easy to manipulate in the laboratory. What I want to talk to you about is, first, other people have already done the work demonstrating that winner and loser effects exist in this species. So in the green swordtails, if you win a fight, you're more likely to win subsequent fights. And if you lose a fight, you're more likely to lose subsequent fights. But one thing that people hadn't done in this system, or really in any other system, was to understand what the consequences of these winner and loser effects are for the formation of dominance hierarchies. And so to do that, the green swordtails are wonderful, because you can set up experimentally an ideal way to measure these effects and how they impact dominance hierarchies. And in particular, we can ask whether winners end up at the top of hierarchies and loser effects produce individuals who end up at the bottom of hierarchies. It seems like they should, but in fact, there's very little experimental evidence that the winner and loser effect have implications for where you end up in a hierarchy. The reason that there's very little experimental evidence is that there's a really tricky thing that you have to deal with when you work with winner and loser effects. So if you put a bunch of animals together and you let them interact aggressively, almost any species you look at, you're going to find that some of the individuals win a lot of their fights, and some of the individuals lose a lot of their fights. But that could be due to all sorts of things. It could be that some individuals are just strong and are good fighters. And the fact that they win, and then they win again, and then they win again, isn't evidence of a winner effect. It's just evidence that they have what it takes to win a fight. That's very different than a winner effect, which stipulates that your probability of winning goes up after you've won last time. Not just that you win all the time, but your probability of winning increases as a function of prior wins. And the opposite for the loser effect. What we can do with the green swordtail is we can experimentally create winners and experimentally create losers, create winning streaks and create losing streaks in individuals that otherwise are as similar to one another as we can have them. So, for example, let's say we've got two fish here, fish 1 and fish 2, and you put them together and fish 1 wins a fight, right? And then you take fish 1 and you put them against fish 3, another individual, and they win again. Fish 1 wins again. This alone is pretty much the kind of data that people gather. Do you win? Do you lose? But there are two possible explanations here. It might just be that fish 1 is a really good fighter, and it wins if you put it against 2, and it wins if you put it against 3, and so on. Or it could be that when fish 1 wins its first fight, that primes it. It makes it even more likely that it's going to win in the future. So how do you separate out those possibilities? The way that we did it in our system is we experimentally created winners. So here's what we do. It's really extremely simple. You get a bunch of swordtails that are about the same size. And they're matched for as many things as you can match them for. Pull out a fish from this group that are as identical as you can have them. Right? And let it interact with a much smaller swordtail. So that the randomly chosen fish that you grabbed from your pool of fish is now put against a much smaller opponent. And we already knew, and we were able to replicate it here, that if you take these fish, if they differ by just 10 to 15%, the larger fish is much more likely to win a fight. So now I've randomly chosen one fish, and I'm going to make it a winner by having it interact with a small opponent. And almost all the time, the randomly chosen fish defeats the smaller opponent. So now I have a fish that has experimentally had a winning situation. Now I go to that same group of fish that are matched for everything that I can match them for. And I'm going to create losers by pairing them up against individuals that are much bigger than them. So now my randomly selected fish has an opponent that's much, much larger. And almost always, the opponent, that I'm labeled bully here, it's just a big individual, will almost always win that fight. And I'm only going to use the cases in which they do. So now I've got a fish that's the same size as the fish that I showed you in the last slide. Except the fish in the last slide had experimentally been given a winning situation, and the fish in this slide is experimentally experienced a losing a fight. And then we take another bunch of fish from that group where everybody's about the same size, and we take individuals and we just keep them by themselves. So when, at the same point at which the other fish would have been interacting with a partner, these fish don't interact with anybody. So now we have 3 groups of fish. Okay? And I've got 18 of these groups of 3 fish. And each one of the groups, each one of the 18 groups, has 3 fish that are all the same size, but one has won a fight, one has had no experience, and one has lost. And what I want to know is whether or not winning or losing in and of itself has an effect on where you end up in the hierarchy. Because otherwise, these fish are identical in terms of size and fighting ability and that sort of thing. The only thing that differs is their experience. And that's what the winner and loser effect is all about. So I throw these 3 fish together in one group, and I let them interact. And I do that for all 18 groups. And after a couple of days, it's very, very easy to measure which fish is at the top of the hierarchy, which fish is in the middle, and which fish is at the bottom. So what happens when you do that? Well, if experience doesn't matter, okay, then if I have 18 groups, just by chance, in a third of them, I expect the fish that had a winning experience to end up on top. In a third of them, I expect the fish that had a losing experience to end up at the bottom. And in a third of them, and 1/3 of the time, I expect the fish in the middle to be of the neutral rank. So just by chance, I would expect to see winners at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom about a third of the time each, and the same for all 3 of my kinds of fish. There should be no pattern if experience doesn't matter. So here I've got the top-ranked individual. So I expect the winner to be there a third of the time, the neutral, and the loser to be a third of the time, if experience doesn't matter. But in fact, when you look at what happened in these 18 groups, experience really, really mattered dramatically. So the first 2 rows here are just what you saw a moment ago. This is what I would expect just by chance. But look what we actually observed. In 18 groups that we had, in 13 of them, the fish that had experimentally received a winning experience ended up at the top of that hierarchy. Only 1 of the fish that had no experience ended up at the top of a hierarchy. So we're just looking right now at who ended up at the top. And only 4 times did the fish that had lost end up at the top. So 13 out of 18 times, the fish at the top of the hierarchy was the winner. So experience, experimentally created experience, mattered dramatically. It puts you at the top of that group if the experience was having won a fight. We can also ask, who ended up at the bottom of the hierarchy? And again, just by chance, we'd expect a third of them to be winners, a third to be losers, a third to be neutrals. But now look, and you see that 13 of the 18 groups that we formed, the loser who had experienced a loss just previous to this ended up at the bottom of the hierarchy. The winner rarely ended up there, and the neutral rarely ended up there. So again, experience matters. If you lose, you're much more likely to end up at the bottom of the hierarchy. And it's losing per se, the experience of having lost, that drove this. It has nothing to do with their fighting abilities otherwise, because they were all matched for that. So winning and losing dramatically affect where you end up in a hierarchy. This is something that afterwards, when you look back on it, it seems fairly obvious that this is what you would expect to happen. But at the time, there was no experimental evidence that I was aware of that really documented that the experience per se had an effect on where you ended up in the hierarchy. So, as I got more and more interested in these winner and loser effects, I began to build simple models of winning and losing and hierarchy formation. And I wanted to see in these models whether or not winner effects, loser effects, whether they had different implications for dominance hierarchies. So in the swordtail case, we know that these fish have winner and loser effects. But in some species, there are only loser effects. Sometimes we see winner and loser effects, and sometimes we just see winner effects. But we don't really know what to predict in terms of the kind of hierarchies that winner effects or loser effects should produce. So I'm going to show you some work that we did with computer simulations. And this work basically takes winner and loser effects as a given. We're starting off in our model by saying winner effects exist or loser effects exist, and we're going to see what implication they have for the kind of hierarchies, the kind of hierarchy that we see in nature. In particular, I was interested in this problem. If you go into the literature on aggression and dominance hierarchies in non-humans, what you find is that there are basically two types of hierarchies that you see over and over again in animals. The first one is what's referred to as a linear hierarchy. This is a hierarchy that, for example, you see in chickens and in wolves and in lots of different species. And it's a kind of hierarchy where it's very clear who's the top ranked, who's the second ranked, who's the third ranked, all the way down the hierarchy. It's very, very clear each rank, what individual holds each rank in a group in these linear hierarchies. More than the majority of dominance hierarchies that we see in animals are like this. But sometimes we see different kind of hierarchy that is sometimes referred to in the literature as a despotic hierarchy. I saw this when I was working with a different species of fish. As a graduate student, I was working with pumpkin seed sunfish, and we were looking at aggressive interactions and in bluegill sunfish as well. And in these species, you don't see linear hierarchies. You can't say what rank every individual in a group has by watching them. In these kinds of species where you have a despotic hierarchy, what you see is it's very, very obvious who the top rank individual is. But it's not at all clear what the relationship in rank is between everybody else in the group. So in this kind of hierarchy, what you see is the top ranked individual beating the hell out of everybody else, but everybody else not interacting with each other very much at all. And so you can't tell where these individuals are in the hierarchy, except that you know that they're not the top ranked individual. They just don't interact with each other that much. All the interactions are the top-ranked individual attacking the others, and the others just running, swimming, flying away. And I was interested in whether or not, if you build models of winner and loser effects, whether they would help us understand why we see linear hierarchies sometimes, and why we see despotic hierarchies other times. So we're going to ask whether or not modeling winner effects and modeling loser effects helps us understand the distribution of these linear versus despotic hierarchies. So, when it comes to building this model, it was extremely basic to do this with a computer simulation. I did it with various different, this was done a while ago, and we did it with various different languages, and we've done it with other languages as well. And what you do is you create a bunch of cyber organisms, which I've represented as chickens here, just so we could visually have something to grasp onto. But they're just little cyber organisms. And I'm going to talk to you about cases in which we have groups of 4 individuals and interactions happen among them. So at the start of the simulation, you assign each of the 4 cyber organisms a fighting score. This is their intrinsic fighting ability. So it's kind of like a measure of how big they are or how much strength they have. And for the purposes of tonight's talk, I'm just going to focus on situations in which I made all of my organisms have the same fighting ability at the start. Okay? So they all have some score, 10 or 100 or whatever, but they all have the same score in terms of their fighting ability. Then I build winner and loser effects in because the assessment of your own fighting ability is affected by whether, if the winner effect is in play, prior wins affect your estimation of your fighting ability. If the loser effect is in play, prior losses affect your probability of losing in the future. And if both are in play, then both are occurring. In these models, your assessment of others, the fighting ability of others, never changes. You only change your estimate of yourself based on wins or losses. It's very easy to change this and make it the case that your assessment of others in your group changes depending upon what you see them do. That's that bystander effect we talked about earlier. We've modeled it where we actually build that into the model. But here, we're not going to talk about that. But it's easy to build into your model. So in this model, you start off with a score of fighting ability, and then it changes as a function of your wins and losses. And I'll come back to this in a minute. So if you build winner effects in, and you only build winner effects in, because remember, you can have winner effects but no loser effects, loser effect but no winner effects. So you want to do each one separately and then do them both together. So if you just have winner effects in play, after a victory, an individual raises its estimation of its own fighting ability. So for example, if we have 2 of our cyber organisms, our little cyber chickens here, and they start off, and they each start off with a fighting score of 10. They assume that their fighting score is 10, and they both have the same score. But one of them is going to win a fight. Whichever one wins the fight, in this case the one on your right in blue, if a winner effect is in play, it takes its fighting score that used to be 10, and it makes it more than 10. And how much more is a variable in the model. If only winner effects are in play, if you lose, if you're the cyber chicken in green here, and you lose, your estimation of your fighting score has not changed at all, because this is just the case for winner effects, and there are no loser effects in this version of the model. You could also make the model only consider loser effects. So when loser effects and only loser effects are in play, after you lose a fight, you lower your estimation of your fighting score. So again, we have the same 2 cyber chickens here. The blue one defeats the green one. Now if loser effects and only loser effects are in play, then the loser of the fight decreases its estimation of its score. So now that it used to be 10 and now it's some number less than 10, and depending on the variable, depending how strong you make loser effects, it could be 9, it could be 7, it could be whatever, just some number lower than 10. And because we don't have winner effects on here, the winners don't change their estimation of their fighting abilities. So So again, this is, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this to be where I was last time. My clicker doesn't work very well. Okay, so here's the loser effect. We can also take this model and we could put winner effects and loser effects in play at the same time, so we can have the model run where when blue defeats green, blue's score its estimation of itself goes up and green's goes down. So you can have loser effects, you could have winner effects, or you can have both. And you just need a couple of more things to get the model rolling and see what happens. You have to have some sort of rule for the animals about when to get aggressive, when to fight. So for example, in the model, your decision rule might be something like be aggressive whenever you estimate your fighting score as more than your opponent's. Or perhaps you have a rule that says fight whenever you're more than half as big as your opponent. Or you could have any fighting rule that you want programmed into the model. And I looked at many different fighting rules, but I'm just giving you a sense of the kinds of rules that you might have. Fight when you're bigger than somebody, fight if you're half as big, fight if you're smaller, although that would be an odd rule, you could have it in there. So that's a decision rule about when to be aggressive. What that means is just by having that simple kind of rule in there, there are three possible outcomes from any interaction between a pair of cyberorganisms. Both players can decide to be aggressive, in which case you have the equivalent of a real fight. Both individuals choose to be aggressive. Both of them have passed the threshold rule for when they're willing to fight. If both of them decide they're willing to fight, you have a real fight. You might have a case where one of the cyberorganisms decides to be aggressive, it's passed the threshold for its aggression rule, and the other one hasn't. It's lower than some threshold and it's not going to fight. In that case, you have what I refer to as kind of an attack-retreat sequence. One animal is aggressive, the other one just goes away after that. And this is what you often see in animals. Sometimes you see true fights. Most of the time what you see is one animal charging at the other one and the other one trying to get out of there. The third possibility is that both players may decide that they're not going to be aggressive. Neither one has passed its threshold for fighting. And that means that there will be no aggressive interaction at all. Now, one nice thing about building a computer simulation is that I can keep track of how many of each of these there are. I just have a little counter and it says, count up the number of times this happens, count up the number of times that happens, count up the number of times that happens. This one, in nature, is very hard to measure. It's very hard to measure the number of times two animals don't interact with each other. Right? You can't, but in the simulation, you could say, you can count up the number of times and you could basically say, in a relative sense, how often should we see some kind of real fight or some kind of attack-retreat compared to no action whatsoever? It's difficult to measure this one in nature, but you can count it in the simulation. And the last thing that we need in the computer simulation, okay, so we have the basic winner and loser effect built in, or both. We have rules about when you should fight. And then we just have to have some sort of rule that determines who wins a fight. So if both animals decide to be aggressive and there's a fight, how does the computer simulation determine who wins that fight? And in this model, it's really simple. The probability that individual one wins a fight when it's with individual two is simply individual one's assessment of its own fighting score divided by individual one's assessment of its fighting score plus individual two's assessment of its fighting score. So for example, if individual 1 and 2 have exactly the same assessment of their fighting abilities, then the probability that individual 1 wins is just a half. Okay? If the individual 1 assesses its fighting score as really high, but individual 2 assesses its fighting score as very low, then the probability that individual 1 wins is very high in the model. So what happens when you have these simple rules in place and you let individuals interact within your group of 4? So I think I had something like 1,000 interactions. The computer simulation simply picked out a pair of individuals at random, let them interact, and did that over and over again until there were 1,000 interactions in the group. Or some simulations had 1,000, some had 500, some had 250. But you let it run for as long as you want. What happens? I'm going to show you what happens, but before I do, let me just tell you how to read these results. The results are going to be shown to you in what's referred to as an aggression matrix, which is really very basic. So an aggression matrix looks like this. Here is some individual I've labeled A, and the 4 individuals in the group are A, B, C, and D. And all a matrix does is tell you how many times individual A defeats everybody else. So if you go to this box, you see, well, A can't interact with itself, so there's never anything here. In this matrix, A defeated B 100 times, so I put 100 in the box that A versus B. And in this case, we have A defeating C 50 times, and A defeating D 160 times. And then you go down and you fill that in for all 4 individuals, A, B, C, and D. So for example, B defeats A 30 times, because here is the B versus A case. So the individuals in the rows are what we're keeping track of here. So, for example, this matrix tells you that A ranks higher in the hierarchy than B, because A beats up B 100 times, but B beats up A only 30 times. So A's rank is higher than B. And then you basically watch either your real animals or your computer simulations run interaction after interaction after interaction, and you end up with something that looks like this. Basically, every box is filled in except for the diagonal, because A doesn't interact with itself, B doesn't interact with itself, but A beats up B this many times, C this many times. If you read this, D beats up A this many times, D beats up B, D beats up C. Okay, so if you just turn the winner effect on, if it's just the case that winning makes you increase your estimation of yourself, but there's no loser effects on in the model, what happens? You end up with aggression matrices that look like this. Okay? And let me just show you what's going on here. Right? In this matrix, A is the top-ranked individual in the group. And I know that because A beats up B 146 times, but B very rarely beats up A. So A has a higher rank than B. A has a higher rank than C because it beats up C all the time, 172 times. C only beats up A 7 times, so it's higher ranked than C. And A beats up D a lot, and D almost never beats up A. So that tells me that when I look at this, A is the top-ranked individual in the group. Now, I go to B, and I see B beats up C a lot, but C doesn't beat up B very much. And B beats up D a lot, but D doesn't beat up B very much. So now I know that B, among the other, if A is top rank, then B is second rank, because it beats up C and D, much more than C and D beat it up. So it's second rank. And finally, we can figure out the rank of the last 2 individuals by looking at this. C beats up D 167 times in this simulation, and D beats up C very rarely, 3 times. So that means that C has a higher rank than D, and that means that that D is now the last ranked individual. And I ran this many, many, many times. And of course, the exact numbers in the matrix vary every time you run the computer simulation. But what you find over and over again is this kind of hierarchy. This is the linear hierarchy that we talked about before. It's very clear when the winner effect is on, but there's no loser effect. it's very clear who's the top-ranked individual. It's very clear who's the bottom-ranked individual, and it's very clear who's in the middle. So you get a hierarchy that's linear, and in this case it's A higher than B, higher than C, higher than D. And the other thing is that what you find when the winner effect is on is that most interactions are fights, rather than one individual attacking the other one and the other one leaving. Most of the interactions are fights. And very rarely do you have individuals who both choose not to be aggressive. It's almost always a fight or an attack retreat, and the vast majority of the interactions are true fights, both individuals being aggressive. So this is what you get when there's a winner effect on, a linear hierarchy where most of the interactions are fights. Now, you get something very, very different when you tell the simulation, just put loser effects on, but don't put winner effects on. Now you get a hierarchy that looks like this. It's very clear who the top individual in this group is. I've just set it up so that it's the A individual. Sometimes it's the B, sometimes it's the C, sometimes it's a D. In this version, it's the A individual, but it's always clear who the top rank individual is. Because A beats up B, B never beats up A beats up C, C never beats up A. And A beats up D, and D very rarely beats up A. So it's clear that A is higher ranked than everybody else. But the rest of the individuals are interacting with each other so rarely that you can't figure out where their rank is. So, for example, in C versus D, C never beats up D, and D beats up C 3 times. But those are so few in terms of the number of interactions that it would probably be a mistake to say that D is somehow higher ranked than C. Basically, they just don't interact with each other very much. When they meet, they both decide not to be aggressive. The same thing is true for B and C and B and D. Everybody except A, when they interact with each other, this quadrant right here is just full of zeros and very low numbers. They're both, every individual in that little quadrant, B, C, and D, will not interact with each other very much. So what you end up with is what we were referring to earlier as a despotic hierarchy. It's clear who's top ranked, but it's very difficult to figure out what rank other individuals in the group has. And in addition, when the loser effect is on, but no winner effect, most interactions are aggressive retreats. Most interactions are the top-ranked individual attacking somebody else who tries to get away. So you end up with very, very different kinds of hierarchies depending upon whether the winner effect is on or the loser effect is on. If you put the winner and the loser effect on, what you end up with is, again, this kind of despotic hierarchy that you saw just with losers. It's very clear that there's one top-ranked individual, and everybody else just does not interact with each other very often. Just what we saw for the loser effect. If you put winner and loser on, you get something very similar to loser. A despotic hierarchy, you know who's on top, but you don't know where anybody else is. And most interactions are aggressive attacks and a retreat, and those are basically the top-ranked individual chasing everybody else around. So if you look at all 3 cases, when there's just the winner effect, when there's just the loser effect, and when both are in play, you see these differences. When the winner effect is in play, you get a linear hierarchy. You predict a linear hierarchy based on this model. When the loser effect is in play, you get a despotic hierarchy. You know who's on top, but you don't know where anybody else is. And interestingly, when the winner and loser effect is in play, the loser effect component is stronger because the hierarchy looks like the hierarchy when there's just a loser effect on. In addition to the type of hierarchy, the kind of aggression is different. When the winner effect is on only, you predict that you'll see mostly fights. When the loser effect is on, you predict you see mostly these attack-retreat sequences. And again, winner and loser both on is like, the results are very similar to loser. So the model tells us something about the relationship between winner effects and hierarchies and loser effects and hierarchies. The model predicts that when you go out into nature and you see linear hierarchies, you predict that winner effects will be predominant in that system. When you go out to nature and you see despotic hierarchies, your prediction is that the loser effect should be in play, and sometimes the winner effect might be in play. So sometimes you may get both. So the model helps us make predictions about how hierarchies can be formed as a function of winning and losing effects, winner and loser effects. So let me just finish up by telling you the sorts of things now that we need to do. So people have documented winner effects here and loser effects here. But what we really need is to look systematically across different species to see whether there are winner effects in play, loser effects, both effects, or neither effect. We need a large database. Then we need to work with those same species and look at the hierarchy that's formed and see whether or not it's a linear hierarchy or a despotic hierarchy. And then we can go about testing the model's predictions. Because what's typically happened in the past is that when people look at winner and loser effects, they look at it in a single species, and they don't even necessarily, most of the time they don't even look at the hierarchy. They just simply see whether or not there's a winner effect or a loser effect or both. But what we need is, using the same set of species, measure the winner effect, the loser effect, both or neither, and then in the same species determine the kind of hierarchy. Then we can test the model. Our prediction would be, where winner effects are predominant, we expect to see linear hierarchies. Where loser effects are predominant, we expect to see these despotic hierarchies. Hopefully, what the model will do is stimulate people to go out and get enough data that we can make broad-scale tests of that. We're still a long way away from that. So I'll just end by saying that one of the nice things about working with non-humans versus humans is that you can do the kinds of manipulations that we talked about in the Swordtails and demonstrate not just that winner and loser effects are in play, but how they determine where you end up in a hierarchy. When you come at this as a kind of behavioral ecologist, you can build models like the model we talked about. And there are many, many other models out there. But this is just one of them. And it makes a very clear prediction. The trouble if you just work with humans is you basically have a sample size of one species. But if you work with non-humans, you can have a sample size of as many different creatures as you can measure. And so you can do things like see whether or not linear and despotic hierarchies correlate with whether winning and losing correlate with despotic or linear hierarchies. You can't do that when your sample size is one species, but you can with animals. And so my hope is that that's the kind of thing that people will do, and that although it isn't directly dealing with human interaction, it helps us better understand the social dynamics that we share with lots of different creatures. So I should stop now, and I am happy to take questions or get into discussions with you for the next 30 minutes or so. So thank you very much for taking the time to come tonight. I appreciate it.
So Kirsten will be in the audience with the microphone, so I'll be happy to take questions, yes.
Hi, Thank you for your talk. I would like to go back to the first part of your speech when you try to discriminate between the experience effect and the intrinsic features of the individual.
Yes.
Well, I was a bit wondering, like, how you can be so sure that the experience will not change or interfere with the intrinsic feature. Like, for example, winning, if you take the fighting as like a physical training, then you could also assume that the fighting itself has increased the strength of the individuals, although the size of neutral, winner, and loser is still the same. So then would also explain why in your scheme the loser has fourfold higher probability to end on the top of the rank, simply because he had a fight, so he got stronger. And also, like, I don't know if you had a chance to measure, like, any change in testosterone baseline or dopamine.
Right.
Yeah, that's again an intrinsic feature. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I understand what you're saying. I'm not sure how winning could do something like change your size per se, but I think that you're right when it comes to these hormones or neurohormones that might play a role. So we didn't measure those, but other people have. And I think that really what is going on here is that the way the animal changes its estimation of its fighting score is through something like testosterone or cortisol. So based on what's been done in other species, I would imagine that if you start a bunch of animals and they're similar to one another, and you give one of them a winning experience, that its testosterone levels, for example, will increase. That's what. And if you give an individual a losing experience, that the stress hormones, one kind or another, probably something like cortisol or corticosterone, will increase, and that mechanistically is really what the winner and loser effect is. Somehow, so if you kind of take the fish work and you put it together with the model says, well, after you've won a fight, you estimate that your fighting ability is higher. Really, that's what I'm talking about. I imagine that the way that your estimation of yourself changes is by changing hormone levels. So, in a sense, you could think of your hormone levels as kind of an intrinsic thing, but they're changing as a function of experience per se, and that is what most likely is driving the winner and loser effect.
I suppose you could test for that mechanistic explanation by interfering with hormone levels, by injecting, for example. So have people done that, and what is the result?
Sure, yeah, people have, well, let's see. I know that people have done things like measured cort and testosterone, baseline levels, and then in winners and in losers. I also know that people have looked at, I don't remember which hormone it was, but they looked at bystanders who just watching had, it was fighting fish, but I can't remember if their testosterone went up or some stress hormone went down, some stress hormone went up if they lost. But people have done that. I don't know if anybody's taken the next step and done things like blocked receptors, for example, or experimentally increased testosterone or cortisol. They've done a lot of the correlational stuff that suggests that they're linked, but I don't know that anybody has experimentally manipulated those things. It could have been that someone did. Maybe someone in the audience can tell me they have, but I'm not sure.
People have done. So Rui Oliveira did exactly the experiment you suggested. So
great.
He had winners and losers and gave winners a blocker for receptors for testosterone.
Okay.
And gave losers testosterone, additional testosterone.
And what species was this with?
A
Birds?
tilapia species.
What's
a fish species.
Oh, really? Okay. What was the name?
Rui Oliveira.
Oh, yeah. So, okay, right. Okay, I didn't know that he had actually done that. I know that he's done a lot.
So the results are actually that if you block testosterone, you lose the winner effect.
Okay, right.
If you give testosterone, you still have the loser effect. And so that also suggests what you were saying, that actually the mechanisms behind winner and loser effects are different from each other.
Right. Right. Okay, thank you. I did not know that Rue had done, I knew that he had played with winner and loser effects, but I didn't know he had actually done the blocking experiments.
Another question.
Thank you.
I was wondering if hormone-wise, the retreat situation is the same as the loser situation.
Yeah. Well, so again, we haven't done the hormone work in my lab. Let me start by answering just in terms of the simulation. Okay, in the simulation, I did not make a difference between the effect of losing a fight and the effect of retreating from a fight. But in reality, those are probably very, very different things. And I don't know if people have experimentally looked at whether or not, for example, testosterone levels go up even more after you've won a fight versus after somebody has just ran away when you fought, or whether or not your court levels, for example, go up more if you actually lose a fight or you just swim away. My expectation is that the fights would change hormone levels more dramatically than the attack retreats. In the simulation, I didn't differ between them, but in nature, I would expect that would be the case, for sure.
Is there a difference between sexes, male or female?
Well, in the green swordtails that we looked at, it's the males that are really aggressive towards one another. And I think there's been a consistent bias in the literature to start with males as the species to look at in terms of aggression, and then from some very small subset of them go and look at the interactions between females. So there are some systems in which the interactions are more female biased. So for example, some primate systems and probably some insect systems. I don't know if there's enough data yet on winner and loser effects to say anything general about sex differences. I just don't think. I mean, my guess is that there's probably data on winner and loser effects in 20 species maybe, and so and most of them are dealing with males, but certainly not all of them. And so we just don't have enough information to say anything about that.
There's a question here.
Does this research apply to other kinds of winning or losing besides fighting, like in sports or in mental games?
I hope so. So I mean, the model, for example, they're just cyber organisms, right? I mean, I took pictures of chickens there, but it doesn't matter what they are. So certainly, for example, I've recently put in a grant that didn't get any money, but the idea was to take these ideas, these models that we talked about and the work on it in non-humans, and present it to people in sports psychology, because everybody who follows sports knows that there are these winner and loser effects that really are a function of experience, that some group of individuals who, for some reason, wins a couple of times, all of a sudden wins all the time. We get these streaks. In American sports, baseball is notorious for this sort of thing, where you have lots of games during the year, and all of a sudden, some team loses a couple of games, and the next thing you know, they've lost 10 games in a row. And then later in the year, they win a couple of games, and they win 10 games in a row. And there doesn't seem to be anything dramatically different physiologically between the players, but the experience is different. And so I'd like to think that this would help us understand winning and losing streaks in other species. I think sports psychologists now really are doing much more of the endocrinology. They are, they take blood samples. They want to know whether or not various different hormones and neurohormones change when teams or individuals win or lose. But again, the connection between that literature and the behavioral ecology literature is really weak. I hope that this gets people thinking about these questions in sports. And, there are probably other areas of human dynamic, social interaction that where you get winner and loser effects. I think it's, I wouldn't be surprised if it was true for at the military level, whether or not, for example, certain groups that experience defeating another group become much more likely to win as a function of that. So my guess is it probably plays a role in some human social dynamics, but the best work is probably going to come from sports, where people spend a lot of money trying to figure out how to make their teams or people win. So that's in the long run what I hope is going to happen.
Yes, it's very interesting, of course, to make the comparison to humans. I was wondering, because in humans you see both the despotic hierarchies and linear hierarchies, if there are animal species in which you see both. Because I would guess that if you don't see both in some species of animals, then the winner and loser effects in humans might be partly cultural.
It's a good question. I'm trying to think if in the non-human literature I can remember seeing, within a species, different populations, some of which are showing linear hierarchies and some of which are showing despotic hierarchies.
Because in humans it's quite clear for different countries.
Right, and I think that in some sense that is due to what we would refer to as cultural differences. The cultural differences themselves are probably historical in the sense that it's based on sort of the history of what's going on in that country. In animals, except for maybe chimpanzee populations that we have enough data on from 30 years, I doubt we just have the information to see whether or not there are cultural differences that lead to different kind of hierarchies in the same species. In humans, certainly, and it would be interesting to to try to figure out how to separate out the cultural effects per se and the more biological genetic effects of this in humans. I don't think anybody's even thought of how to do that yet. So I don't know, but it's a good question.
Okay, thank you.
This is the problem with working in a system where there's some information but not a lot, as you end up having to say, I'm not really sure yet, but hopefully we can look at that.
So while the microphone is traveling to the next speaker, I cannot resist asking you this question that I alluded to in my introduction. So how did these winner and loser effects evolve? It seems to be a really stupid thing evolutionarily to submit to something like a loser effect. So I haven't actually built the evolutionary models myself. I know you've done some of that work. Some of my colleagues at Florida State have done some of that. I'm not sure I think it's as stupid as the way you're suggesting. I think that if, in fact, winner and loser effects tell you something relevant. So, for example, if you win a fight, or if you win a couple of fights, that is information. That tells you your relative ability compared to others in your group. If you lose a fight, that tells you about your relative ability compared to others in the group. And at least in non-humans, it is the case that individuals at the top of hierarchies, for example, have access to more food and more mates. But individuals in the middle and the bottom of the hierarchy certainly do as well, not as much, right? But if for example, you didn't have a loser effect, right? And
you had no way to gauge if you didn't pay attention to the wins and losses in the past, you might, for example, continually behave some way that's likely to get you beaten up. And that could have real consequences in the long run. You may end up on the bottom of the hierarchy in both ways, but one way you may end up on the bottom of the hierarchy in pretty good shape, and the other way you may end up at the bottom of the hierarchy really beaten up. And again, for the winner effects, I think the same kind of thing. If that information tells you that you're a better fighter than others in your group, then it might make sense for you to fight. When you phrase the question like, well, why would anybody want to be or accept being at the bottom of the hierarchy? I think it's a good question, but I don't think it's a question. In these social groups, it's going to happen. You're going to have aggressive interactions with others in your group, and you're going to win some, and you're going to lose some. And that means someone is going to be higher up in the hierarchy, and someone is going to be lower in the hierarchy. And the question is, how can you maximize what you get given where you are? How do you make the best of a bad situation? The best of a bad situation for an individual who's not a good fighter might be just stay the hell away from everybody else as much as you can. You're going to end up at the bottom of the hierarchy, but at least you're not going to be beaten up. So I think that's my guess as to what's going on. I do know that in one set of models I know about the winner and loser effects, the loser effect was easier to evolve than the winner effect. And that's sort of interesting because when you go to the animal literature, and if you find any effect, you almost always find the loser effect. And then in some subset of those, you find winner and loser effects. But most of the time, you get both effects or the loser effect, and not only a winner effect. So I still think we need to do a lot more modeling on this, because you see a lot of linear hierarchies out there, but you don't see a lot of systems where there are only winner effects in play. And yet the model says when winner effects only are in play, that's when you get linear hierarchy. So there's some disconnect there. We need to do more modeling of that. I hope that that will happen. I don't know if it's going to be me, but I hope that it will happen. Yeah.
I was wondering, when you look at the different matrices, here I am.
Oh, okay, thank you. I couldn't. Right.
It feels kind of logical, the kind of matrices you get when you have only the winner effect or both the winner and the loser effect. But what I don't understand is how one individual gets to stand out when there's only a loser effect. Where does the big difference come from?
Right.
How do you stand out when you don't have a winner effect?
Yeah. So it's a good question. The way in the model, what happens is that, at least for the ones we talked about tonight, everybody starts off with the same estimation of its fighting ability. So whatever that score might be, everybody assumes that they have that score. You put together, you randomly form pairs. Right? And at the start, everybody estimates their score as, let's say, 10, just as an example, okay? So you estimate your score is 10. You estimate your opponent's score is 10. And so most times, there's some sort of aggressive interaction. Somebody wins and somebody loses, just by chance, okay? You do that 10 times and 20 times, you find very quickly that individuals that just by chance lost their first couple of interactions are the ones that end up in that place where you can't tell who's who, because just by chance, one individual wins a lot at the start, and other individuals lose. And as soon as that kicks into play, the rest of it just follows. The individual that by chance won a few times ends up never lose. If it wins a couple of times, it stays, its estimation of itself stays the same. Okay? Others interact with it. They, by chance, have lost a few times. They decide that their score compared to who they're interacting with is not worth fighting. And when they meet others who have lost, there's no fight. And when they meet the individual that by chance got off to a good start, there's an attack and a retreat. And so once you get some individuals winning and some individuals losing by chance, you immediately sort of started separating everything out. And then the model just keeps making those differences greater and greater. The winner just never loses, never has to lower its estimation because nobody is willing to interact with it anymore after they've lost a couple of times. Whereas in the case with the winner effect, you never decrease your estimation of your fighting ability. You either keep it the same or you increase it, which means that everybody is always willing to fight because you just estimate your opponents based on their size. You don't change your estimation of them based on whether they won or lost, so they look the same to you. But you either are the same or higher, which leads to the fights, which leads to the clear linear hierarchy.
Next question
I was wondering, apart from the hormonal changes, what is it exactly in the experience of winning or losing that makes you have a higher chance of winning or losing in the future?
That certainly is the golden question, right? We don't know, right? I mean, what we know is that there are winner effects and that there are loser effects. We know that there are these hormonal correlates of them. What else occurs in the brains of these animals in terms of ways of estimating their fighting abilities? We just don't know. So right now, the best we can do is the hormonal work. I don't know what else it would be. I don't even know what else it would be in humans, except you could say what people think, but then you could also do the proximate, you can measure the things that are measurable, and again, you'd probably be in the same position.
I want to say something regarding her question. At least for humans, what I've heard is that one of the strongest forces inside you is to keep intact who you are. So to keep yourself the same and resist change, even if that change makes you become better. I mean, to keep your identity. So in that case, it could be that if you've lost some fights, you see yourself as a loser. That's your identity, and it's hard to break it apart, to destroy your identity, even if it is to become something better. So, yeah.
So I think my guess is that either the person who came before me or the person who's coming next time is going to be talking exactly about that. I wouldn't have the slightest clue how to get at that in non-humans. I mean, I think it's going to be hard to get at in humans exactly what that means. In non-humans, all we can do is say, what do they do? And what kind of changes that are measurable are going on? And that's the best we can do. I hope that the speaker next time will address it in humans, because I think that's what it's all about, is the identity. It could be that the equivalent thing is going on in non-humans, but we have no way at this time of figuring out what that would be, how you would look at that. Yeah.
Coming back to the question about function and evolution, if I'm right, there is no individual recognition in your model.
There is no individual recognition in this version of the model, yes.
Wouldn't it not be a much wiser strategy for evolution to make rules in which you would only have a loser or winner effect against the opponent from which you lost or won the fight?
Yeah.
And so be naive with respect to an unknown opponent.
Right.
And if you model that, what would then be the outcome?
Yeah, so those are two good questions. And you would expect that if the animals have the cognitive machinery to individually recognize others in their group. And certainly,
well, we know they have, otherwise they couldn't have a social hierarchy. And you can always have a linear hierarchy if they know each other individually.
But we have no individual recognition in this model, and we have linear hierarchies.
That's right.
So I'm just saying, I'm saying I agree with you that most of the time it probably is the case that when we look for it, we often find individual recognition in non-humans. And it would make sense to only pay attention, to only lower your estimation of yourself relative to the opponents who have defeated you versus everybody else. We actually did model that a long time ago, and I don't remember the difference we got for compared to this version of the model, but certainly if you could only scale your estimation of yourself relative to the right individuals, you would expect selection to favor that sort of thing. But I guess when I built these models, I wanted to sort of start from scratch and say, suppose if that wasn't in place, can you get linear hierarchies and do you get despotic hierarchies even without individual recognition? And you do. The exact effects of individual recognition, I don't remember the models we did with individual recognition per se, so I can't tell you the difference.
So someone in the back has been trying to ask a question for a long time. And I suggest that is our last question.
Yeah, I think we ended up with a lot more linear hierarchies, but which would make sense. But I wouldn't swear to it. I think that's what we ended up with.
Thank you very much for your question. I have a question about the purpose of the fight. Would the winning effect or the presence of the winning or the losing effect be determined by the purpose of the fight? Whether the purpose of the fight is for a mate, for food, or for territory. An animal might not fight to the best of its abilities if it is not fighting for a mate and probably fighting for food that is abundant. Right. And probably that might affect its way of fighting.
Right. But I think that's certainly true for the way that animals interact with each other, that the more valuable the resource, the more likely individuals are to expend energy to fight and get that resource. In the models, and even in the Swordtail experiment that we talked about, we've sort of not addressed that issue at all. We've simply said that we want to understand where you end up in the hierarchy, the assumption being that the higher up in the hierarchy you are, the more resources that you get. But in reality, you're going to fight differently depending upon whether it's for food or a territory, or if you're hungry and you need food versus if you're not so hungry and you need food. There's all kinds of information that animals strategically change their fighting as a function of how hungry they are, how long it's been since they made it, all of that. We simply did not build that complexity into the model, again, to ask what would happen if you started with the simplest possible thing. Nobody can recognize anybody else. And we're not making a distinction about the resources you get. We're just asking if the winner and loser effect changes the kind of hierarchy. But obviously, when animals really fight, they do gauge their fighting based upon the resource in sophisticated ways. But we don't know what that would do to our model.
So I suggest we close the discussion here. Before you all leave, there's two things I'd like to say. The first thing is that I would like to bring to your attention the lecture of next week Tuesday to be precise. And this will be a lecture in Dutch again, Machteloze Maakbaarheid by Paul Verhagen. And he's a professor of psychology from the University of Ghent. The second thing is that I would like to thank you for being here and also for your contribution to the discussion. And also I'd like to thank Lee for giving an excellent talk. Yeah. And,
the questions are wonderful. I wish I didn't have to say we don't know more. I wish I could say that less often, but we're still early in this stuff. Thank you very much.
So on behalf of Studium Generale, I would like to give you a present, a book, The Angel Maker by Stefan Brijs. So.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Wow.